Now we're going to switch gears and invite up David Goldfarb to talk to us about the Stony Brook Regional Sewage Authority.
Thank you. Before I begin my presentation, I would say that I'm happy to have St. Paul's as my neighbor, and in fact, the house I live in was once the rectory at St. Paul's and was moved down Charlton Street during the first decade of the 20th century. And of course, I'm reminded that I'm a neighbor of St. Paul's every day at 8, 12, and 6, but it's really not much of a problem. So I'm here tonight to talk about Stony Brook. For those who may be watching at home and are not familiar, Stony Brook treats all
David, would you be more comfortable?
Just get close.
No. Why don't you, would you
Sit there. You sit there.
sit?
It's on.
No, sit and use one of those table mics. It might be better for you. Don't you think they work a little better? See if that helps.
So, to those who may be watching at home and are not familiar, Stony Brook treats all of Princeton's sewage. The sewage is collected by a municipal agency, the Princeton Sewer Operating Committee, and is delivered to Stony Brook to be treated. And in addition to Princeton's sewage, Stony Brook also treats sewage from West Windsor, South Brunswick, Plainsboro, the Hopewell Valley, West Windsor, if I didn't mention it. It's a regional agency that was created in the 1970s, and Princeton at the time was the largest user by far, and over time the other users have started to catch up. If you're watching in the agenda, I don't know if we can get it up on the screen, but you can see the financial results of Stony Brook starting back in 1990 up to the present, and there are a few trends that I'd like to point out. One is, of course, if you look at the squares, the second from the top, the charges to the participants, including Princeton, have been remarkably stable over the last decade. But if you look down near the bottom, second from the bottom, you can see that the revenue that has come from sludge incineration at the River Road plant has declined over time, and although it's still profitable and contributes significantly to our budget, there are some concerns with the ongoing viability of sludge incineration, including environmental concerns, meaning that it's very tightly regulated and we comply with all of the regulations, but it's entirely conceivable that the regulations could become so onerous that it would no longer make sense for us to continue in the incineration business. Also, it's obviously very energy intensive. Energy prices, as you know, have been relatively low recently. If energy prices increase significantly, that could also make incineration no longer viable. And if the profits from incineration are no longer available in our budget, that means that the charges to participants are going to have to increase. If we move along to the next slide, this is my favorite slide, and I think I've shared it with you before. This shows the flows to the River Road plant, which come from Princeton and from South Brunswick and West Windsor, and the parts of Plainsboro that are served through South Brunswick. There are a couple of very significant pieces of data that are shown in this. One is, if you look at Princeton, if you start at the left, it appears at the top. That's Princeton's flow. And over time, you can see that Princeton's flow has decreased significantly. It's decreased significantly despite the trends in Princeton. Obviously, between 1995 and the present, we have added a lot of new customers. Princeton University alone has grown enormously during those 21 years. But what we have achieved through I&I reduction, tightening up our system, has reduced the overall flow significantly. And if you look at the line below Princeton's, which is the South Brunswick flow, Princeton and South Brunswick had moved pretty much in parallel until Princeton started its intensive I&I removal program, and we are now significantly below South Brunswick. And frankly, I think during those 21 years, the parts of South Brunswick that are treated by SBRSA did not grow relative to Princeton. I think Princeton grew relative to South Brunswick mostly because of development at the university. This is significant because Stony Brook allocates all of its costs to participants based on flow. So the smaller Princeton share is of the total flow, the less Princeton pays. I would also like to point out another significant piece of data, which is the rainfall, which is, if you look at the lower right, it's that jagged blue line. The rainfall currently, this is this is a moving 12-month average. The rainfall is about as low as it's ever been during the time that we've been measuring it. And obviously there's a very strong correlation between rainfall and flow, particularly in systems that are still somewhat leaky, like Princeton's. So the fact is that even though Princeton, the trend is significantly negative, and that's because we've tightened the system, it's somewhat exaggerated because we are currently at a very low rainfall period. And as rainfall returns to normal, which one would probably expect it to do over time, Princeton's flow is likely to increase, meaning that we're going to pay a larger proportion of Stony Brook's total costs. If you move to the next slide, or next page in your agenda, it shows how Stony Brook's budget is made up. And unlike almost every other government agency, salaries and benefits are actually not the largest expense at Stony Brook. The largest categories, it's the single largest category, but it's not over 50%. The large categories include energy, obviously, both for the incinerator and for the treatment process, and also capital expenses, including construction costs and debt service. The plant is 35 years old. It is approaching the end of its useful life, even though it's been maintained over time. There are large capital investments that are required, including a very expensive expansion in Pennington, and also one to follow in Hopewell. So these capital costs are obviously going to be passed along to customers, including Princeton, even though we don't benefit directly. It's all the costs of the entire budget are shared pro rata based on flow among the participants, and therefore we're going to pay our share of the construction costs for those plants, and also the other capital costs, just because the system is getting older. So that's another cause of concern with respect to our ability to keep the participant charges level as they have been over the past 10 years. If you look at the next slide, or the next page in your agenda, what you can see is that Princeton, over the past 11 years or 12 years, has saved a significant amount of money because of the investment that we've made in reducing I&I. And that's the one thing that is directly in Princeton's control that allows us to see some potential for reducing costs in the future. Princeton still has a very leaky system. All you need to do is go back to the rainfall chart, and you can see that there's a significant correlation between rainfall and Princeton's flow. Our collection system in Princeton is still old. There are large portions of the system that need to be replaced just because they're old, and there are also large portions of the system that should be replaced because they're leaky, and if you replace a leaky system with a tight system, you reduce the extraneous flow into the system and reduce the charges here in Princeton. The fact is that we are not even keeping up with replacing the system based on its age. I know that sewers are not the first thing that people think about when they're thinking about capital expenses. It's that nobody's going to come up to you and thank you for replacing a sewer. But it is a piece of our infrastructure. It needs to be maintained like the rest of our infrastructure, and to the extent that we can reduce extraneous flow, there is a return on our investment. So I know that it's not easy to allocate additional funds in any capital category, but I urge you to look carefully at the age of the system, the condition of the system, and the plan for maintaining it over long periods of time, and put an emphasis on trying to identify the places where the extraneous flow is coming in and tightening up those particular parts, because to the extent that that's done, there's an immediate payback and a continuing payback over time. The only other thing that I want to make you aware of with respect to Stony Brook is that there is an agreement among the 6 participant municipalities that governs how Stony Brook charges the participants for its services. That agreement included what was known as a debt service adjustment that was in lieu of a connection fee, and that over time returned a great deal of money to Princeton, because Princeton, as one of the early contributors, spent money when it had a large pro rata share, and that money was returned as other participants came in and started reducing Princeton's pro rata share. That debt service adjustment has expired under its own terms. There are still some minor rounding adjustments that will continue over the next several years, but the expiration of that debt service adjustment was at the end of last November of 2015. And there's currently no system in place for new connections to be charged. In other words, even though Princeton charges a connection fee and includes the capital costs that Princeton has paid at Stony Brook, if there's a new connection in South Brunswick, Princeton does not have a mechanism for recovering the investment that Princeton has made in Stony Brook, so that the new connection in South Brunswick repays Princeton for its investment. This is unfair, and it can only be remedied by unanimous agreement among the 6 municipalities. That's the way the participant agreement is set up. Obviously, there are going to be winners and losers in it's a zero sum. Connection fees are paid by the expanding municipalities and are collected by the municipalities that are not expanding. But it is something that I think deserves some attention. I think the only mechanism for trying to address it is by bringing it to the attention of all of the municipalities and trying to get some consensus on some sort of connection fee or other replacement. That's not going to be an easy process. That doesn't mean it shouldn't be started, and Mayor, if you'd like, I can sit down with you and we can talk about how that might happen. Because to the extent that Princeton does reduce its flow, and to the extent that other municipalities expand relative to Princeton, both of which are entirely possible, Princeton will be cheated over the succeeding years by not having a mechanism in place to recover our investment. So that's currently the state of Stony Brook. I would say it's been a great fiscal success from Princeton's point of view for a decade, and I think it's unlikely that that pattern of very, very low increases is going to continue over an extended period of time because of additional capital costs and because of rainfall trends. And mostly those two things. So I think you should be prepared for somewhat higher charges at Stony Brook and should carefully consider significantly larger investments in repairing our leaky sewer system.
Okay. Thank you.
Are there any questions?
Well, I know that at our next meeting, we're going to be talking about our capital plan, and so I would encourage us to take your comments into light when we talk about that. And I want to thank you, too, for I know that sewers have been a passion of yours for a decade or more, and that you should be given a lot of the credit for the progress we've made. So I want to thank you for
And they really are, the sewers are literally the most rewarding part of my history of public service, only because I absolutely know that if it weren't for me, these things wouldn't be done. You could ignore trees and somebody else would pay attention. You could ignore roads and somebody else would pay attention. I feel if I ignored sewers, nobody else would be paying attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there any other questions?
David, before you leave, I'd like to thank you for your foresight about 6 or 7 years ago when you were on Borough Council and I was on Township Committee, and you and others on Borough Council agreed to share the cost, the getting in cost, to start the work on the solar plant. And you should know at this point that we are 2 approvals away from being able to put a spade in the ground. One of those approvals that we're lacking is from the Canal Commission, and they apparently have some concerns about runoff that have to be answered, and will be answered. And the other is from the county, and they have some concerns about runoff also. Basically, we've tried to assure them that the site is capped. Nothing that we're going to do there will change that. There's 2 feet of fill above the cap. Nothing is going to change that. We're putting the solar panels on top of the fill, and they will not add or diminish the runoff from the capped site. So with a little luck and maybe a little urging, we'll get the last 2 approvals and work will commence on the solar facility.
Well,
So thank you for your help all those years ago that got the project started.
Well, whatever role I had at the time was extremely minor, and it's very fortuitous that we have a large electricity user, the Stony Brook treatment plant on River Road, directly adjacent to an empty space that it doesn't have any other purpose. This is the ideal situation for solar generation, and it will significantly reduce Stony Brook's electricity costs, and those savings will be passed along. I'll say this, and it's entirely understandable that the Canal Commission may not be a big fan of Princeton at the moment because of what happened on the battlefield, and so any feather smoothing that can take place might be productive, because I think they're inclined to be to delay approvals just because of their experience on the battlefield. Thank you.
Hey, David, I have when you presented to CFAC, you talked about some ways in which we could actually test where our system might be leaking, and you talked about the fact that when we do our sewer work, it's typically tied to our roads, but that, and so we sort of have prioritized the sewer work based on the condition of the roads, but in fact that may or may not be getting at our most leaky parts of our system, and that we could reduce our inflow, outflow, whatever, to Stony Brook more if we made, that wouldn't be a capital investment, but it was, you were talking about maybe $50,000 worth of work to identify those areas?
Well, yes, absolutely. And in addition to being Princeton's representative at Stony Brook, I'm also the chair of the Princeton Sewer Operating Committee, and we are focusing on this issue with Bob Huff. We need to take a scientific approach to identify the areas that are leakiest in our system and focus our efforts on repairing those systems, because that's, when we repair where the system is leakiest, we get the biggest return on our investment. I think Bob is receptive. Either, we could do this either by having municipal employees do it or by having a contractor do it, or a consultant. It's just a question of metering, putting meters in the system and finding where the flows increase and then tracking it back to the source. It's not difficult. It takes some diligence and time and effort, but it's not a technology that it's very advanced. It's just a question of putting meters and cameras, which we can do within our pipes, and finding where the leaks are.
But is there anything we can do to be supportive of that effort? Because it
You know,
seems like
I'm
it would make a
hoping,
lot of sense.
we meet with Bob. When we meet with Bob's sympathetic to us, and at some point, Bob meets with Mark, and then Mark meets with you, and I'm not exactly sure what happens between when we meet with Bob and when Mark meets with you. So, yes, if you want those kinds of things to happen, you know who to talk with.
We do,
you.
I think, want those things to happen. So I would like to see it happen.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.